Good afternoon, and welcome virtually to Old Dominion University and its remote experience for young engineers and scientists program known as REYES. My name is Giovanna Gennard, Assistant Vice President for Strategic Communication and Marketing and co-chair of REYES, and I will serve as your host for today's event on offshore wind in Virginia, featuring Paul Olsen. The purpose of the Global REYES program is to offer free virtual learning experiences that increase science literacy, inspire and train future generations of STEM-age students. Today's discussion with Paul Olsen offers us insight into a pilot project that has the potential to transform the future of clean energy. Throughout this webcast, you may submit questions through the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. Following Paul Olsen's lecture, we will answer as many of your questions as time allows. It is now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Paul Olsen. Paul, would you please turn on your microphone and video so we can see you? Paul Olsen is the Executive Director of Programs and Partnerships for Old Dominion University's Office of Research. In this role, he enables research projects between the university and federal agencies, including the Department of Defense and NASA, as well as regional organizations in the public and private sectors. Paul retired from the U.S. Army with the rank of colonel in 2015. His culminating assignment was command of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Norfolk District, where he gained national recognition in sea level rise planning and modernizing ports. Since then, he has been a regional leader in mega projects for port modernization, aerospace, and offshore wind initiatives. Olsen is a registered professional engineer in the Commonwealth of Virginia and holds a Master of Science degree in Civil Engineering from George Mason University, as well as master's degrees from Webster University and the U.S. Army War College. Of note, he was named the 2014 Champion of the Port for Hampton Roads, the 2015 Government Engineer of the Year by the American Society of Civil Engineers, and is the winner of the Pentagon's prestigious 2004 PACE Award for Innovation. Paul currently serves on the board of directors for the Virginia Maritime Association and the Commonwealth Center for Advanced Logistics Systems. Please join me in welcoming Paul Olsen to REYES.
Thanks, Giovanna. It's a real honor to be here. It's an honor to be amongst all engineers, young and old, upcoming and future engineers. It's an honor to be part of the ODU team. Very thankful to President John Broderick for the opportunity to be part of his administration over the last 7 years at ODU. And before I start, I'd love to give a shout out to any veterans in the audience that might be listening in today. My fellow ODU faculty and the students out there at ODU, and future engineers from all around the world. This is a neat program. So what we're going to do is, let me jump on over to my slides and we'll get going. So hopefully we see a splash slide. And sorry, I have a very light trigger finger on my mouse, and I appreciate the introduction. But before I talk, I would like to showcase a recent product done by the Office of Offshore Wind at ODU that gives you a few minutes of a broad picture of what's going on with offshore wind in Virginia, and then we'll unpack it from there over the next hour. Now, Karen Meyer and I have been working out our signal for rolling the video. So Karen, let's do it.
2 centuries ago, in the California gold rush of the 1840s, American author Mark Twain said, "During the gold rush, it's a good time to be in the pick and shovel business." A new gold rush is now taking place off the U.S. East Coast, where offshore wind prospectors have staked claims where they will invest $100 billion over the next 10 years. The largest announced investment to date is Dominion Energy's 2.6 gigawatt project off Virginia. Near where the first permanent English settlement in America was founded lies the Chesapeake Bay entrance and a complex of natural harbors and industrialized waterfront areas known as Hampton Roads.
We are starting with 2 turbines off of our coast. We hope to expand that to 2,600 megawatts of wind energy off of our shores.
We invite you to learn more about the advantages of this historic region for investing in the pick and shovel business of offshore wind. Hampton Roads is rich with abundant maritime assets. 4 Port of Virginia terminals, 4 commercial shipyards with large floating dry docks, and dozens of smaller ship repair and boat building facilities. Located in the central mid-Atlantic, Virginia is well positioned to be a supply chain hub that can receive, build, and deliver the largest offshore wind components to all existing U.S. East Coast lease areas. With ocean transport at 10 knots, Virginia-built components can reach any lease area or its marshaling port within a day and a half. The Port of Virginia routinely serves post-Panamax, ultra-large container vessels and is also accustomed to receiving and handling the large cranes that serve those vessels. The container cranes at Virginia International Gateway are of the same scale as offshore wind turbine foundations. It is thus easy to envision the port supplying American-made steel in the water for hundreds of offshore wind turbines up and down the U.S. East Coast. With upgrades now complete at the Port of Virginia's other container terminals, Portsmouth Marine Terminal is now being evaluated as a major offshore wind supply chain hub. It is the only terminal on the U.S. East Coast with sufficient land area to host fabrication and assembly of all offshore wind components. Each eastern state has its own rich maritime heritage, with waterborne commerce dating back to the colonial era. But in modern times, Virginia has more full-time shipyard workers than all other mid-Atlantic states combined. Virginia also is home to more than 500,000 workforce-ready veterans who have rotated out of military service and thus well-suited for new careers in offshore wind.
And we are preparing to submit a lease application to secure locations in federal waters now for wind energy research and testing and environmental data gathering that will move offshore development of wind resources forward more quickly.
Virginia recently collaborated with Dominion Energy and Ørsted to allow for construction of 2 6-megawatt wind turbines off of our coast. This will be the first deployment of commercial-scale turbines in federal waters.
With the port's unique waterfront properties, Virginia's unparalleled shipbuilding workforce, and Hampton Roads' deep, wide channels with unlimited air clearance all the way to the open sea, Virginia is unmatched in its offshore wind manufacturing potential. From corner office to shop floor to research lab to vessel deck plates, Virginia is all in for offshore wind.
Okay, now if that doesn't make you want to become an engineer or a port engineer, you need to get your pulse taken, because that, in my opinion, is an excellent video. I'd like to say I did it myself on my computer. I did not. There are experts that communicate these sort of mega projects out there, and the one who pulled this together was my own program specialist, Miss Rima McManus. So Rima, if you're on, that was a great video. It's a great message, and super proud of your efforts there. So let's get back to the presentation. We're probably going to have to, yeah, there's the Karen slide again. Well done, Karen. Hey, before I start, I got a shout out. I got a shout out. Okay, now this is REYES, which is remote engineer experience for young engineers, and we're remoting all the way out to my home state of Wisconsin. So shout out to Mrs. King's 7th hour biology class, who's not studying offshore wind right now, but they are studying offshore biomasses, which in itself are an energy source of the future. So thank you for calling in, Warhawks. And I know it's the last hour of the day. Thank you for hanging with us. Okay, so let's take a look at offshore wind and break down everything that you saw in the video to hopefully give you a better perspective of what's going on in Virginia and in offshore wind in general. First of all, as leaders, can't do anything, nor should you do anything without a goal. You always want an objective where you're shooting for. And our governor in Virginia gave us a good objective of 2.5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2026. That is enough power to power most of coastal Virginia. He put that goal out there, and as a state university, ODU is helping with many achieve that goal with our local power providers. One of my favorite books that I go to before I lead any mega project is called Leading Change. Leading Change, I heavily recommend it. It's by John Cotter, and he says before you start any project that's big and needs a lot of people behind you, you have to pull together what he calls a guiding coalition. So before you have any great endeavor in engineering, get together all your stakeholders, brainstorm everybody, and figure out, let them know what you're doing, because it might be chaos at first, but if you can get everybody charging in the same direction, that's important to any mega project. So you see some of those partners that I've listed there. We have the state, of course, the great Old Dominion University. We have our energy providers, our European experts in Ørsted. The port, you saw in the video how active the port is. Believe me, offshore wind is just a speck of what's going on in the Port of Virginia. Another developer, Avangrid, our planning district, the people who are behind businesses in the area, Virginia Maritime Workforce Council. So you got to get the workforce of the future to get ready for this gold rush, if you will, and a lot of others. So offshore wind is not only happening in Virginia. If you look on the upper right of your screen, you can see those multicolored polygons all the way from off of Massachusetts down to North Carolina. Each one of those represents a current offshore wind lease. So Virginia is that square second from the bottom, and North Carolina is that one below that. That's Dominion and Avangrid. That's the ones I'm going to be focusing on today. But they are more up to the north. Why are there more up to the north? Well, it's windier up in the north. But you might say, hey, Paul, aren't there hurricanes in Florida? And I'd say, of course there are. So you have plenty of wind down south, but the wind up north is more regular, it's more predictable, it's a higher quality wind. That's why you see more leases as you go up the East Coast. So drilling down to the lower left, on the left, that's the border of Virginia and North Carolina. And then right on the continental shelf there, you see the square and that sort of crazy triangle formation. The square is the Virginia lease, which I'm going to be talking about, and that is Dominion Energy's commercial lease, which is about 200 wind turbines going into that big square. And then the sort of triangle is the North Carolina lease, which will be Avangrid Renewables. So two different power companies putting in two different leases, developing two different leases, both of them off the coastal Virginia and North Carolina. On your lower right, you'll see a breakout of the Dominion lease off of Virginia. And I'd like to point out that the bigger squares are the commercial leases. That is where the power generation turbines will be in. But those smaller squares along the left-hand side, and there's two on the top and bottom, those are unique in the United States. Those are the only offshore wind research leases in the United States. Now, this is super exciting for us in Virginia because nowhere else do we have offshore wind research playgrounds, if you will. It's like being a university with your own particle collider out there. Everybody wants to come in and try it out and do experiments. So the Commonwealth, in their wisdom, gave us those research leases too. So a little bit of offshore wind 101. And of course, if you've got questions, put them in the comments and we'll get to them, because we're going to cover a lot of turf very quickly. Here is a general cartoon diagram of what an offshore wind farm looks like. First off, if you call those things windmills, you have to go through this whole lecture again, okay? We don't call them windmills, they're wind turbines. In your typical project, you've got about 30 to 100 of these that are linked together in an underwater grid of lower voltage. Think of every one of those turbines like an individual building in a city, and those buildings connect up to a residential grid at lower voltage. The grid then goes to a substation where it all comes together, and that low voltage is stepped up to high voltage. And why it's stepped up to high voltage is that that power then has to be transmitted 27 miles or so over to the grid onshore. And when you're transmitting electricity over long distance, you always transmit at high voltage so the electrons stay on the wire. If it's transmitted at lower voltage, the electrons have a tendency to want to fall off your wire and go to the center of the earth. That's what electrons do. So that's why it's high voltage from the substation to the grid substation where it feeds the commercial grid. Another big idea that you have to take in account when we're talking about offshore wind is, don't think of the turbines as a single component of offshore wind. It's important to break them down because every component has a different purpose and every component has a different manufacturing and workforce requirement. So first of all, we have blades. Currently there are 3 blades per turbine. Some are in development with 2. The blades are being developed not in Virginia. Those are being imported in, and the 3 blades come together at the top area where you actually have your turbine, and this is called the nacelle. The nacelle is where all the magic happens, where you transform your wind power into a turbine, which then generates electricity. That nacelle is, for the most part, also constructed outside of Virginia and then assembled, transported and assembled in Virginia to be put on the turbines. You then have your tower section, self-explanatory. It's full of transmission wires, which then goes down to a transition section. And then jumping over to the right, that is your foundation. It's called a foundation. And what you're seeing right here is a suction bucket foundation, which goes and sticks itself into the sea floor. And just like if you walk through a bunch of mud in a boot, you can't get your boot out of it. It actually sucks in around your foot. It's the same concept. However, this is not the foundation that we're using in Virginia. We're using monopiles, which is simply a dagger, if you will, foundation that's stuck into the seafloor. So different components have different requirements. So these components are all assembled onshore at a construction port. You saw Virginia, you saw our construction port, and we're looking at transforming some of our port, which normally brings in containers, into offshore wind component assembly points. It's going to be busy on that continental shelf. And this particular wind farm for Virginia is 23 to 27 miles off the coast. I've been out there a few times. It's a couple-hour boat ride on a tourist boat. And once you're out there, you can't even see land anymore. The important thing to recognize with this is all of those vessels that you see are unique vessels. They're called TIVs, or turbine installation vessels. Those are the ones that you see us putting in the foundations. And then on the right, you see an array cable laying vessel. Remember that underwater subsea grid, that's what they're putting in. For you autonomous systems experts, we've got drones underwater and ROV, because you gotta Make sure when you're on the seabed that you don't find any old cabling or any old wrecks or some protected species. There's, of course, security boats out there and a lot of other survey vessels. Then when we start putting on the blades, you can see that turbine installation vessel is just loaded for bears with all the sections on it, putting on blades. We've got on the left an offshore substation, which is just like the substations you see in your neighborhoods, but these are on reinforced pilings and ready to take that low voltage from the turbines, step it up to high voltage and shoot it over to Virginia and into the grid. Of course, the best way to get to those nacelles when they're mounted is by helicopter. So you see a helicopter out there with technicians and maintenance, and these things are big. In fact, a turbine, when it's all assembled and all ready to go, these ones are taller than the Washington Monument. A little for your maritime engineers, here's a breakdown of these turbine installation vessels. We don't have any of these in the United States. In fact, for the turbines that I will show you, we had to use a turbine installation vessel from Europe to put in these turbines. And for every engineering problem, there's always an obstacle to be overcome. Our obstacle was something called the Jones Act, where you can't use a foreign flagged vessel into an American port to do this type of work. So for these two turbines that we put in, this vessel actually had to port in Halifax, Canada, run down, do its installations, and go back and forth. The good news is, well, you can't change the Jones Act. That will take an act of Congress. But one of our energy providers, Dominion Energy, has now contracted out the United States' very own turbine installation vessel with the idea of once we have our wind farm established, this vessel might be working up and down the East Coast. So here's some neat pictures. Here's some of the components. I mean, just so you can get a scope of this engineering, here is a TIV being loaded up. There you see some of the components of the transition piece, being nicely nested into its hold for overseas traveling. Again, look at the size of the workers here. Here's one of the first tower sections being put in. There's two of them being cinched down, but wait, there's more. You cover the deck, and then you start putting two more on the top. Again, these are monsters. If you look to the left where you see the equipment being stored, you just cannot, engineers, you just can't use a normal port key to put these things. You really have to build up the bearing strength quite a lot to have these loaded up. Here's the second one, all ready to go. So remember, there's these two up top and there's two below, and the transition and all the other parts are already in the TIV. The TIV steams out, and here is Virginia's first two wind turbines in federal waters going in. What you're seeing there is the monopole section being stabbed into the seafloor, with all the other sections at the ready to be assembled onto that turbine. For the French speakers out there, I speak French, but that I see Vol au Vent is the name of that ship. And I believe it's kind of loose, but I think that means wind chaser or wind stealer. Be wondering if there's any French speakers out there that can give me a better translation on the name of that ship. Okay, so going back to this idea of a guiding coalition. Remember I talked about Cotter? How did we get there? Projects like this just do not come out of an engineer's notepad or a good idea and gets executed. This needs a whole of government and a whole of community approach. So going back to Cotter, the first thing you have to do is put together that guiding coalition. Identify in anything that you're doing in your life, engineering, who are your biggest stakeholders? This isn't just your engineering firm and your client. There's always other people you have to deal with. You have to deal with environmental regulators. You're going to have to deal with transportation boards. You're going to have to deal with city councils. For your first engineering projects, you're not going to have a lot of stakeholders. But once you start having mega projects, you need a lot of stakeholders. Now, each one of these people have great leaders, fantastic leaders, from governors to CEOs to just magnificent business people, and they all have their own agendas. So the trick is get them all in this group and give them a neat name. So you get them all in the group, and I call them the XCOM, which is short for the executive committee. And they're all happy because, like, wow, we have a name, we're the XCOM, and they like being the XCOM. But give them something to get that teamwork on, just like it's a basketball team or whatever, because these are all the players that you're going to need to push your mega project forward. So I'm sorry I'm into all these charts here, but this is kind of important because as engineers, you got to get your team together for whatever project you're going to be doing. So of course you got your XCOM up there, which is kind of your board of directors. But who's going to give the XCOM any authority? On your left, you see that our authority comes from a memorandum of understanding from the state to Old Dominion University, ODU, that gives us the authority to do all of this planning and resourcing. And then on the right, you've got your advisory people. There's always people with opinions out there, and whatever project you're doing, there's probably an authority. This is the Virginia Offshore Wind Development Authority, and these are all the people who are going to keep your policy side straight, because you in the XCOM, you don't care about policy so much, you care about execution. And in our case, execution means steel in the water. Okay, this is probably one of the second major point to future engineers out there. I will argue to you, and I submit that any mega engineering project that you're going to be involved with, and this is my fourth one, any mega engineering that you're going to be doing, big projects, you're going to have 5 lines. Where's my hand? There we go. 5 lines of operation coming at you. So in offshore wind, you have project development is one line of opportunity. These are the guys and gals who are going to be putting steel in the water. Then you've got technology and innovation. These are the smart researchers that not only make things, but they research things to make them better and more efficient. You have your supply chain. None of this happens without businesses that are going to make the parts and get the parts and stand up the industry around it. And then none of this also works unless you've got the skilled and workers to execute your project. Now, a lot of times for offshore wind, this is very technical, but who knows, in your first project that you have an engineer, you actually may be short of tradesmen like plumbers and pipe fitters and stuff like that. This is a recurring problem. So make sure you're thinking about where your workforce is coming from. And of course, for a mega project, if you don't talk about yourself, someone else will. So you want a team that's talking to your General Assembly and Congress, and you want a team out there who's telling your story. So a shout out to ODU and your community engagement people, because what you do for ODU is you tell our story for us, and you do a great job of that. So thank you, ODU Community Engagement. So Project Development Committee, I already sort of introduced you a bit to them. This is all about getting your project done. Steel in the water. If there's anything that slows up your project development thrust, you need to get in there as a leader and solve that problem. Right now, we just can't put our turbines in the water without having BOEM permits and reviews done. Currently, BOEM is understaffed for that offshore wind gold rush that's happening. So that's the problem that I'm focusing on right now at the federal level, to work with Congress to get BOEM more funding so they can review all these projects that are going in the water. So that's one idea as a leader. If you see a problem in project development, attack it. That's our governor on the right, Governor Ralph Northam. Those are our 2 projects, our 2 pilot projects for Dominion Energy and Ørsted. And each one of those is taller than the Washington Monument. And those are the first two in federal waters. People ask me how much power those produce. They produce 12 megs worth of power, about enough for probably about 5 strip malls. Busy slide, but this is the amount of detail you have to get down on project development. So there, the picture, you see that commercial lease off of Virginia. And then the 12 megawatt pilot project is laid out on the lower left, about everything an update to your executive committee on everything that's going on there. But more importantly, the 2.6 gigawatt commercial project in the big yellow squares. You've got all the requirements laid out down there. You've got all the unique vessels being discussed. And so important is you've got a project management timeline that you absolutely have to stick to. Stick to your timeline, on time, on schedule, on budget. That's what a good engineer does. Equal time to the offshore wind lease off North Carolina. This one is being developed by Avangrid. It's called the Kitty Hawk lease, named after Orville and Wilbur Wright's flying first aircraft, which was flown right in the Outer Banks for the first time. This is a smaller project, but very essential as well. The interesting thing about this project is North Carolina doesn't have the mature grid to take on the power that's going to be generated from this energy source. So this North Carolina lease will be transmitted at high voltage up to Virginia and join the grid up there. More information for Kitty Hawk is listed up there, and they're just doing a wonderful job too. Okay, that's second committee. Follow along in the squares up there, those thrusts that I tell you every mega project needs. Technology and innovation. This means trying to get other people's money to solve your problems. That's what a research university does. We've been doing pretty well at ODU. We've won 4 proposals for just under $2 million. This allows us to research things to make offshore wind better and more efficient in the future. These are the fish we've caught. The top 3 are fish that got away, that we fished, we applied, and we did not win those grants. We just picked up another one in the middle of the screen, and all the rest that are green are still lines in the water. If you become an engineer at a research university, you always have to have your proposals in. If you get 1 out of 5, 1 out of 7, you're doing well, but you got to have as many lines in the water to make the fishing metaphor. Third thrust, supply chain. If you do not set the conditions for industry to come to your mega project, industry won't come to your mega project. They'll assemble your components somewhere else. They'll float them into where you want to be, and you won't get any economic boom or any you won't enjoy the gold rush that is offshore wind. Virginia is unique, ladies and gentlemen, for offshore wind because I think you saw a lot of those components go in and out of our ports standing up erect. The good thing about Hampton Roads is we don't have any bridges, we have tunnels. So as much as our commuters hate the fact that we have tunnels, it's really good for offshore wind assembly because they can go in and out without any overhead obstruction. We also have amazing shipyard capabilities, and many of the same skills that you need to build a ship you can use to build the tower section and the foundation section. So we really have all of the components here, and our supply chain development committee does well to keep us aligned. Again, I can't stress this enough. You can have everything laid out for your mega project, or in our case, offshore wind. But currently, when I started this project 1.5 years ago, we didn't have one soul in Virginia that was even qualified to step on a turbine. We didn't have the credentials. We didn't have the training. So we quickly identified the 4 focus areas that we needed to train our own workforce, or transition our veterans, or cross-train our shipyard personnel. And we have identified those, and happily, we now have 2 organizations that are doing the workforce development and training up the workforce of the future for offshore wind. Of course, I won't dwell on them. If you're in engineering, I would concentrate on mechanical and civil and structural, business and project management. Always a business aspect for offshore wind, and get those certificates after your degrees because hiring officials are looking for those certificates. So here's the type of training that we're doing here. And we had to actually step up our own training in Virginia. This is really important. We've got 2 major providers here, and I recommend you Google them. New College Institute out in Martinsville, Virginia, and Centura College in Norfolk. at these two locations, we are training the workforce of the future. Here you see some recent pictures taken recently of ODU's own Rima McManus. This is my own project program development specialist that I sent to training so we could better understand how it unfolded. So sent her, and she went through the training. Very, 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 it's not for the faint of heart, but we're very proud that she was one of the first 2 graduates in Virginia on this safety training. I asked Rima to put this slide together, not to show how tough she is, but to show all of the exciting stuff you get to do to be an offshore wind technician. So if you love to climb, if you love to rappel, we definitely have jobs for you. If rather you'd like to do your structural designs and calculations, plenty of that too. There's just so many opportunities in offshore wind, very exciting. Finally, like I said, if you don't talk about yourself, someone else will. Upper left shows that all of our members of Congress in the Hampton Roads area and now beyond are getting together for a coalition to support offshore wind. On the upper right, you find your association. In this case, it's the American Wind Energy Association. They just changed their name. I got to update the slide. But the big idea here is, instead of buying your own booth, see who else is on that executive committee. Everybody pool your money, just like you did at the lunch table, pool your lunch money and get something big, like a pizza or something. In this case, we all pooled our funds for outreach, and we laid on the biggest, most awesome booth at OWEA, and we got the nation's attention doing that. Again, shout out on the lower left to our ODU's president, John Broderick, who has been our inspiration, who has set up town halls and outreach opportunities. And of course, there you see direct engagement with members of Congress. They are so bought in on this and looking forward to a future that's mixed in with renewable energies. So I'm getting to the end of my presentation, and then we're going to leave some time for questions and answers. And then I'm going to get back to you with some closing thoughts. But I will leave you first with this idea. Before you do anything in a mega project or even in a small project, figure out who your main stakeholders are. Put them in a group. Keep them informed. Listen to them. As an engineer, you're not necessarily in charge of it, but you're in charge of the coordination and the deconfliction. They don't always teach you that in college and in high school, but guess what, engineers? That's going to be your job. And then underneath, you have to think about your job in terms of your project, technology, supply chain, workforce development, and outreach. And on your project, make sure that you've identified one person to cover down on each one of those aspects, and you will have a successful project. So we covered a lot of ground. We still have some more to cover. I still have some closing thoughts. But at this point, I would love to entertain some questions. And if you're still with us and you might be a college junior or senior smelling for an opportunity in offshore wind, a little bird might have said that there is an amazing job being advertised right down there. You can follow that link and apply for it. And also, if you're interested in other opportunities in offshore wind, I think you saw my address on the splash slide. If not, I'd ask Giovanna or Karen to put my address and email in the comments. I'll add you to a group that I put out on distribution for when other opportunities for offshore wind come out. So Giovanna, I hope I've kept us on time, and I would love to see if there's any questions.
Yeah, Paul, we really appreciate you talking with us about the basics of offshore wind power generation and distribution, and for sharing your insights on a mega engineering project that can transform the future of clean energy. So now we'll go into taking questions from our live audience, and I want to remind our audience that you can continue to submit your questions in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. Mine is at the bottom of my screen, and we will answer as many of your questions as time allows. Now, we do have some questions already, Paul, and I'm going to start with two that have similar themes, and those are regarding if there's any research that's currently being conducted to see how wind turbines will affect the coastal ecosystem and its wildlife.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I get it a lot. And the short answer is good news. It's not significant, and it's actually beneficial in some areas. But let me break this down. The first point is recall that our turbines are 25 miles offshore. 25 miles, you're really outside the migratory lanes of the migratory birds. They really don't migrate that far out because they can only fly a few scores of miles before they have to rest. So they hop up along the coast. They kind of leapfrog from preserve to preserve. So the birds are for the most part out okay. There's some gannets and some shearwaters and stuff out there, and they actually are enjoying some more. Well, they actually nest on land, but they sort of sit on the foundations and take a little break, if you will. The marine mammals, we cannot do our installation outside of their migratory windows. So there are marine mammals out there. Again, most of them are migrating 25 miles within the 25 miles limits. That's why I like the ones that are out there. But we are following the NEPA rules. If you have seen on the diagram, we have monitoring vessels. There are statutory requirements. So I'll level with you. I'm an environmental engineer. That is my background. I'm really down with wildlife and everything. They are increasing fishery habitats, and the ones way offshore are not significantly affecting the wildlife is the short answers. The earlier ones that are closer into state waters, those are the ones where you have to be concerned about bats and migratory species. But the ones that I showed you on the slide, those are in federal waters, and that's where the future is going to be. They're out there.
And Paul, I also remember hearing from our colleagues at Dominion Energy that the turbine foundations were installed within the window allowed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, otherwise known as NOAA, for the pile driving activities to make sure that the North American right whale was protected.
Yeah, I'm sure that's pretty loud on the whales. The windows that they establish, we definitely take all that in consideration. And there's laws out there like the Marine Mammal Act, you follow the laws. And that's, as an engineer, you have to be aware of all those regulations, whether you're building on or offshore.
Thanks for that. I know that earlier you talked about the supply chain piece. What are the needs for students in supply chain to be able to work on such a mega project as this one?
So right now, if you're a business student, we have our first 2 turbines in the pilot, and engineers know you do a pilot before you do your project so you can get your best practices and lesson learned. If you're a business, this is really exciting because these are when the contracts are being let right now for the foundations, for the tower sections, for the blades, for spinning turbines, for all sorts of things. So supply chain is going to be needing business developers, contracting and procurement folks. So that's the most important thing for the business business majors to be focused on. The video said, and it's a great quote, when it's a gold rush, it's a great time to be in the big pick and shovel business. So even if you're not involved in the turbines and the blades and the nacelle, there are all sorts of downstream businesses that are popping up over Hampton Roads, like spinning transformers, for example, or gravels for the sub-base foundations. So the opportunity is out there, and there is, if you go to Virginia's website or send me a link and you're interested in, if you are with a company and you want to register your company with the supply chain inventory, Giovanna put my email in comments. I will hook you up with the database that the industries are looking to hire people right now.
Thanks for that, Paul. One of the things that people are wondering about too is if you can talk about what are the benefits of offshore wind versus the large land-based wind farms that you see in the Midwest.
Yeah, I'm from Wisconsin, and I go back there to see my folks and see my brother and everybody, and I'm very happy to see in central Wisconsin the emergence of these onshore wind farms. They are similar to offshore, but they're their smaller cousins. They're just not the same in scope and scale. I got to tell you, I'm not an expert on them. I think that we've recently learned in Texas that they do require some maintenance, and they don't work in extreme cold weather unless they're winterized. So like any other piece of equipment, they need winterization. What I'd be curious about is comparing the effectiveness of the turbines in colder climes versus the one in warmer climes, and figuring out what the true requirements are. But onshore is a lot older than offshore. I've got a great associate named Stephen Hester that I can refer anybody that's interested in terrestrial onshore wind turbines. Get them in that, get them into that market there. I'd like to focus in offshore, and the main difference is scale, scope, wind speed, and the amount of power generation. So I think I answered the question.
You did, thank you. And then once an area is chosen for a wind farm, how do you determine how many turbines can fit into the area without them being too close to each other, so that the distributed air effects doesn't affect power generation capabilities?
That is a fantastic question there. I've never had anybody ask that question. I've always had to brief it, and I forgot to brief it. So I'm glad that question was asked. So blue ribbon to ever ask that one. This is really interesting because those turbines out there on the outer continental shelf, they can spin and turn themselves. So what the pilot is doing right now is those pilots are covered with sensors, and they are actually picking up how one turbine affects the others with eddies, if you will, to use common terminology. But really what we're modeling and studying, and ODU is involved in that, is the wake vortex that results behind one of the turbines. So as crazy as this sounds, with all the eddies and stuff going on, if you get a turbine on the leading edge of your area, it's going to have an eddy behind it, which will affect what the best direction or orientation of the one behind it should be. So given the eddies, maybe that one is oriented to the left or the right, or maybe even backwards. So these are very dynamic systems. So it's not just, in Dominion's case, going to be 200 turbines that are all facing which way is the wind's coming from. They'll be on a smart system. Once we get the modeling and simulations all figured out, ModSim, any ModSim folks out there, and each one of those will make them more efficient. And thus, if it's more efficient, it drives down the cost of kilowatt hour, which then goes back to the ratepayer so they don't pay the big electric bill. That's where your technology and innovation thrust comes on in. And to answer the other question, how many turbines can you put in? There's safety requirements, there are standoff requirements, and I don't know, but there is a system that limits how many turbines that you can put in. Dominion initially was looking at about 220, and now they're looking at about 200. They're trying to maximize, but there are standoffs, there are safety constraints. And by the way, where they're sited is nowhere near the federal channels. So the big ships will not be steaming in and out of those turbines. But what we're already seeing is a very popular offshore wind tourist industry popping up for tourists that want to go out and see the offshore wind turbines. And those are being offered out of Virginia Aquarium and Rudy Inlet Tours. They're both the ones. I highly recommend that tour.
And so how fast do these wind turbines go for them to safely and efficiently work?
Yeah, they have, first of all, they have governors on them. So I get the hurricane question often. And again, I'm not the developer. I'm not the designer. Mm-hmm. There are definite engineering safety considerations built in them. I have been told anecdotally that they are built tough enough to withstand a Class 2 hurricane. If you do have a hurricane or a threat of the hurricane, they do not spin crazily. They're actually cinched down and the blades are oriented to reduce the Bernoulli effect. I don't know actually how fast they can spin. So I would have to, I don't know the answer to that question. If anybody else does on the chat room, I don't know their max speed, but it would depend on the turbine. But when you see them, it's more of the fastest that I've seen, it's been a very lazy arc. But if you think about the geometry of that, if that arc is going pretty slow on the outside, on the inside, that turbine's moving pretty fast too.
And someone now, again, just kind of getting more into the weeds of how the wind turbines are put together. They would like to know if you can elaborate a little bit more on the fabrication and construction of the components at PMT.
Yeah, I can. So right now, think about the components being assembled in various places and then brought into the Port of Virginia into a component port like PMT. PMT has received funding from the General Assembly of Virginia to develop this port, which is like a 1930s or 40s era port. So right now, as I've touched on before, these are very, 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 very heavy components. So a port that was built to service World War II era tanks and stuff like that, getting them over to the war, it just doesn't cut it anymore. So right now, there's a lot of civil engineering studies that are being done, and the Port of Virginia has done to increase the bearing strength at PMT. So when these components come on in, remember the two that we have out there were assembled in Halifax, put on a TIV, and then assembled, put together on the outer continental shelf. But that's not efficient. So the future ones, think about the components coming in to a port like PMT. The bearing strength is then reinforced, and I envision, because things can change. Each one of those tower sections, the foundation, the transition section, the nacelle, and the blades, all assembling, all coming together at PMT or another port with strong bearing strength, and then being loaded like you saw on the TIV, with the tower sections and the blades and everything. The TIV steams out there, puts in the turbines, and then comes on back. I'm not sure. I know Siemens is the company that's building the nacelles and the turbines. I don't know how they're doing it, but I do know that they might be being constructed remotely and brought in. But what you're looking at PMT or another port is that assembly point where those major components will be put together and then loaded on a TIV and shipped out.
And then as those components are being brought in, people are wondering if we have all the types of these, regarding the vessels, if we have the types of these installation vessels in the US flagged fleet.
Yeah, I touched on that in the presentation. The answer is right now we don't. You need a US flagged vessel to operate in and out of your port. And the TIVs, the turbine installation vessels, along with some of the other vessels, they are specialized. So we are bringing them in from Europe and doing their tasks, coming back and forth from Canada. But that's not how you run a railroad. So to get around that, Dominion Energy has got a turbine installation vessel, your critical vessel, under contract right now to be constructed. So it should be completed by about 2023 or so, which is just in time to start putting up the big wind farms. And I would expect after the TIV is done with our Dominion wind farm, it would go to another wind farm like Avangrid's to the south, or start working its way up the coast. But that vessel will be US flagged, so it doesn't have the concerns of the Jones Act. So we've had to build our own.
And do you foresee that the wind turbines' operational readiness rates will be managed just like you would a fleet of aircrafts in the future?
Oh, another great question. I don't know about if that means if it's going to be managed like on the maintenance side. I think that we will take a lot of lessons learned from the Europeans and the Asians who have these wind farms out there. I think this is a great question for industrial engineers to solve, but clearly they're going to have to be on a maintenance schedule. They're going to have recurring maintenance, preventive maintenance, contingencies, all that. I think they probably will have downtime just like an aircraft does for maintenance. I am sure they're going to be scheduled. They're not just going to be out there and forgotten for their 50 plus year span, life year span, 50 plus year lifespan.
And speaking of maintenance, someone wants to know if the blades of the turbines are going to be tracked and balanced like helicopter blades. Really great question.
Yeah, I know they are. They can shift. They can what's the word? Matriculate or something. They are movable to maximize the Bernoulli effect. At the end of the day, you know, it sounds like we've got some aviation enthusiasts on there. I also submit that, you know, these wind farms, you have to know your fluid dynamics. You have to know your aviation engineering, because these blades are just like blades of an aircraft. It's all about Bernoulli, the Bernoulli effect, and maximizing those things. Unfortunately, I don't have enough experience with that. That would be a good question that I can send over or link up you know yourself with the turbine blade manufacturers. There is a heavy science behind this. It would probably be a fascinating topic of itself. But yes, the more efficient your turbines are and the more they can react to the different conditions, the more kilowatts you will be able to produce. How about one more, and then I've got a closing thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone would like to know what's the hardest part of this project?
Right now, as we speak, it's the federal permitting, but we are attacking that and we're going to get it done. And that's what's taking the most of our time right now, to make sure that the industry makes sure that everything they're gearing up for is ready to go in permitting. The hardest part for me, well, I just love mega projects, so nothing's hard, but I think keeping everybody informed is always the hardest part. So you always want to over communicate as an engineer on your project as you can, because engineering doesn't always look right when it's going in, but as long as it looks right when it's done, that's what matters. So communicating is key. So I'm gonna, if it's okay, I'm gonna leave with a parting thought. Thank you for listening to me for an hour. You're all future engineers, scientists, technicians, or maybe not. Maybe you're just interested in engineering. I never want any of you to forget in this point of your career, no matter what you do, no matter what you're going to be, you matter. You matter by showing up today. You matter by taking the time away from whatever you're going to be doing today to learn about something of interest in engineering. Because I can promise you, you're going to remember this presentation when you run into an offshore wind technician, and you'll be able to do what engineers have done throughout the centuries, and that's to solve problems. Now, I had a nice quote that I was going to read by Teddy Roosevelt, which is about the man in the arena, but I don't think we have time for that. But what Roosevelt was saying is, guys, engineering is hard. You have your great days, you have your tough days. Critics, and you'll have your fans. But at the end of the day, it's not the critic that counts. It's you, the engineer, that's got the calculator out, that's got the Revit program going, or that's on an offshore wind turbine doing your safety inspection. It's going to be hard some days, but at the end of the day, you're in there, you're competing, and when you get done with your first project, even if it's just a sidewalk through a park, you will always remember the satisfaction that you've had being an engineer and building something that lasts. Now, my email is on there. If you ever got a question about engineering, if you need an old mentor that's been around the world a few times and you have a question, or you just say, hey, I want to be an engineer, but I don't know where I want to go, I'll give you my 2 cents. I'm happy to do that, because when I was a young engineer, there were those that did it for me, and I'm happy to pay it forward to you. Don't forget, you matter. Thanks for listening to me, guys.
Thank you so much, Paul. That's really great advice. And I want to also invite our audience to keep in mind that for engineering, in addition to the fields that you mentioned, also fields like cybersecurity and computer engineering are really important to green energy efforts like this mega project that you mentioned. So on behalf of Old Dominion University and the REYES program planning team, I would like to thank Paul Olsen one more time for joining us today. We will continue to follow the story, Paul, and its impact on clean energy for years to come. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to the Office of Strategic Communication and Marketing, the Office of Distance Learning, and the Office of Community Engagement for their support of this event. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. For more information about upcoming REYES lectures and our summer program, visit odu.edu/REYES. And on March 30th, just next month, at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we will be exploring the laws of nature and its implication, listen to this, for a simulated universe. You cannot miss this presentation. We look forward to you joining us then too. So today's session has been recorded. I know we had some questions about that. And if you'd like to watch it again and share it with friends, you can access it from the REYES website at odu.edu/REYES. This concludes today's program. Please have a wonderful rest of your day.